Hi, everyone. My name is Mareike Mohlmann, and I'm based at Bentley University. Thanks for the kind introduction. This is actually our campus. So it's, we're based in Greater Boston, in the Greater Boston area. Thanks again for inviting me. I'm very, very pleased. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Sorry, I'm still recovering from COVID. Portugal is so beautiful, so I really feel like missing out. These are some screenshots of my work addressing algorithmic management. And I'm actually really pleased that this topic or this work is of interest to the quality management community. And I guess it's just generally of interest to those who are, who have an interest in or who are curious about the intersection of management, AI, and datafication, and how digital technologies are changing society. So I think it's a topic that's probably of interest to a lot of management-related disciplines. So today, I would like to talk about a specific paper which was recently published in the MI's Quarterly, and also I would like to touch upon a few HBR articles that really translated that paper or the findings of that paper to more practice-oriented audience. And so it will be, the presentation will be a tiny bit more focused than Joseph's presentation, which I enjoyed very much. And because I will focus on one specific case as an example, and that is the ride-hailing platform Uber. And before I start, I would like to also pay tribute to my wonderful co-authors on this paper, Leah, Ulla, and Robert. But let me get started with a specific business problem that many online labor platforms face. Taking Uber as an example, and I think it's a good example because many of you probably use it quite often, use Uber at least occasionally, if not even often, right? So I don't know who's using Uber quite occasionally. I use it a lot, actually. So you probably came across the fact that in the past few years, there have been really heated discussions over the fact whether Uber drivers should be classified as employees or as contractors. And in most jurisdictions around the world, Uber drivers are actually classified as contractors. And the reason is that that is a quite cost-effective strategy for Uber, right? Why so? Because they do not need to pay benefits, they do not need to pay the drivers in case they're just waiting to be matched, right? So it saves Uber a lot of money. But then on the other hand, because they are not employees, because they're contractors, that also means that officially Uber cannot tell drivers what to do, right? Compel drivers to show up at a certain time, at a certain place. And that could jeopardize the seamless service production. So what is the underlying issue here? The underlying issue is really how to control crowds without formal authority. And how does Uber solve this problem? So they solve this problem by employing algorithmic management. And later I will touch on the fact that it's not necessarily ethical, right? But millions of remote workers are being managed just by an app. And so really that results in a situation that many Uber drivers see the algorithm as their boss. So as mentioned earlier, I really want to dive into algorithmic management here. And given that my background is information systems management, you can tell that I, as researchers, are more interested in the role of digital technologies, of AI, right? So that is kind of important to us when we think about management. So what is our definition of algorithmic management? So it's a large-scale collection and use of data to develop and improve learning algorithms that carry out coordination and control functions, traditionally performed by human managers, right? And they do that in a very highly automated and data-driven fashion. So in this particular project, we're actually interested in unpacking algorithmic management, trying to understand what it really means, right? What are the subdimensions? What are the characteristics of algorithmic management? And also how that really affects platform work. So let me just very quickly touch up on previous literature. So who of you in the audience would agree to the statements that online labor platforms such as Uber are marketplaces that match demand and supply? Do you see any hands? You're tiny on the screen, so probably many of you would agree to that statement, right? Of course, why not, right? So that is the dominant view in economics-inspired literature on platforms. And there's a lot of previous research on crowdsourcing, such as mTurk, on gig work, such as on Upwork or TaskRabbit, where workers are being matched to jobs, right? Or where even creative professionals can be matched to a particular project. So there are a lot of online labor platforms out there. And previous research has shown or argued, well, mTurk and gig work, that's definitely different from these traditional work environments that we see in brick and mortar organizations, right? Because work is structured differently, it's communicated differently, and it's delivered differently. So we also know from this previous research that digital technologies are important, right, to facilitate this matching and supply. Think about websites, think about smartphones and apps and the algorithms embedded in those technologies. So in sum, we know that previous literature really has this dominant perspective, economics inspired, that online labor platforms are marketplaces that match demand and supply. However, some people would argue that's a limited perspective, right? So there's really need to understand control in these settings much better and work on the control of work with technologies, with algorithms on these platforms is still in its infancy. So researchers increasingly recognize that OLPs, such as Uber, they're not only marketplaces, they're also organizations, because only organizations can control. Right? Marketplaces, they just match. It's different. It's very different. So we draw, as a meta theory, we draw on the theory of meta organizations. And that is really meta organizations. Goyer, 2014, Gulati, 2012, wrote a lot about that. The idea is really that we think that online labor platforms, they are these meta organizations. Why so? Well, in the words of Gulati, I quote, they solve the problem of organizing without explicitly relying on formal authority as enshrined in an employment contract, right? So we argue that these OLPs, such as Uber, that they're actually combining elements of both, right? Traditional marketplaces and organizations. Okay, so we conducted a study in the context of Uber. I don't want to dive into much detail. We got a lot of interviews. We talked to Uber drivers. We talked to Uber executives. We harvested information from public forums and so on. There were 3 data collection waves in New York City and London. So we really talked to drivers in those 2 cities. And then we coded the data. So we used grounded theory to approach the data. This is just a screenshot. I don't want to go into much detail. You can read that up in the paper if you want to. I think it's probably much more exciting to directly dive into the findings. So this is the model that we developed, the theory that we developed. And you can really tell that on the one hand, in line with existing information system literature, which is inspired by economics literature, platforms like Uber are marketplaces. They are multi-sided markets. They have elements of these multi-sided markets, right? So on the one hand, Uber is really a marketplace and they employ algorithmic matching. So the left side of the model, like this whole left side of the model really mirrors this perspective that Uber is a marketplace, right? So they use algorithms to match different sites. The algorithm really uses input and output data to do so. They may employ search pricing, right, to incentivize drivers to serve a certain geographical area. Who has come across search pricing? It's sometimes something customers don't like because suddenly, they want to go somewhere and there are not a lot of drivers around, and suddenly, they ask to pay like $100 to get home from the airport, something like that. So, probably most of us came across search pricing, but it's a dynamic pricing mechanism that they are implementing there to really incentivize drivers to hit the road. This is algorithmic matching, right? And algorithmic matching that results in certain work environment characteristics, such as Uber advisors being very autonomous, right? So they can really show up to work whenever they want to, at any time, at any place. And there's also a lot of uncertainty, right? They're not employees. They don't know for sure whether they will get jobs, right? So it's not like they have a contract which tells them, for the next few months, you get like XYZ amount of jobs. So this is the left side of the model. Yet we find that Uber is much more, right? So we find that they employ algorithmic control. And that helps them really to make sure, for instance, that drivers show up at a specific time, that they can really make sure that there is this high quality service to the customers. So the right side of the model really illustrates this perspective, right? If you have a look at the right side of this model. So the algorithm acts as a boss. What does that mean? It means that drivers can automatically be penalized by the app, for instance, in case their rating drops below a certain threshold, right? It's automated in the system. The app can just kick them out, not assign them to jobs anymore. There's little human interaction, right? They have almost no opportunity to talk to human, ask them, why is that happening? Why am I being penalized? So algorithmic control also means that platforms such as Uber, they use a lot of process data, right? Not only input and output data, which is quite common. We see that, for instance, on platforms such as Airbnb. Input data could be, for instance, this is the house that I want to list, and output is like, this is the rating you get, right? So data is much more important for algorithmic control because there's a real flow of data. And if there wouldn't be a real flow of data, the system could not react in real time to changing environmental variables such as demand and supply that can change every 5 minutes, right? Or the traffic situation and so on. So algorithmic control can only be implemented by collecting huge amounts of data and feeding them into the algorithms in real time. Another feature of algorithmic control is nudging. And I would like to dive deeper into that. And you see nudging is listed right here because I think it's quite interesting. Actually, do quite a lot of work on nudging. So what is nudging, right? It is really a way of how organizations, platforms, you see that in all kinds of contexts. But for example, here, Uber can really control and manage individuals without exhibiting force, right? They're not, individuals are not forced to show a certain behavior, right? But these companies learn from individual preferences and then expose individuals to personalized information to kind of nudge their behavior in a certain way. So it's really more based on psychological tricks. And I brought you one example. We see that right here, right? So you're you're $6 away from making $40 in net earnings. Are you sure you would like to go offline? And then a lot of drivers are probably, no, let me continue driving. I'm almost at $40, right? We see something similar in the context of social media platforms, right, where there has been this criticism that, for instance, individuals are nudged into voting for certain parties, right, or nudged into buying certain products. Or so there are a lot of different examples. Even sometimes individuals are nudged in a positive way, right, nudged into eating healthier foods. But in the context of algorithmic nudging, we can say it's much more powerful than offline context, because really personalized data is being used to expose individuals in real time to this kind of information, which makes it much easier to kind of manipulate them into doing certain things. So nudging has been criticized, given that there's this fear that it leads to manipulation. And I would agree that this is the case at Uber, right? Uber has not been doing this very ethically. Yet, I just wanted to point towards my work in the HBR here, that I think that in theory, nudging can be used for good. It can be a very powerful tool. And if designed ethically, and if beneficial for all parties involved, if companies are transparent, then nudging can be something very positive. And I'm just also quoting here the work by Taylor and Sunstein, who were actually awarded with a Nobel Memorial Prize in economics for their work on nudging in 2008, arguing that nudging leads to wealth, health, and happiness. So it's really double-edged sword, but we see that it's definitely a very powerful tool in the context of Uber, probably not designed in a way that is very ethical, but it doesn't mean, if you think about other contexts, that always has to be the case. Okay, but let me shortly get back to the model after diving into this one variable here. So we see that algorithmic matching and algorithmic control leads to work environment tensions, right? Sometimes, Uber drivers face challenges. They feel like the algorithms are not transparent. There's no predictability, right? On the one hand, they experience autonomy. On the other hand, supervision. So there are a lot of really tensions there that they experience. And so we argue that platform work is really in this conflicted middle, right? In this conflicted middle of being contractor-like work, working on a marketplace, and that is really the left side of the model. And then on the other hand, employee-like work, they're being controlled, and we typically see that in hierarchical setting. That's the right side of the model. At the bottom, we also see responses. So we find that workers really show organizational-like behavior, such as loyalty, but also market-like behavior, such as gaming. And I brought you this quote here. This is actually a quote that led to the fact that our research was featured on the front page of the UK Times in 2017, because we really find that drivers were flocking together, logging off the app, then surge pricing kicked in, and because it's only updated or was updated every few seconds, then they all logged in at the same time. They were matched to rides and made good money, right? What we are saying, this is a completely legitimized market-based behavior, right? As a contractor, you're allowed to log in whenever you want to. And this is why actually Uber did not have any legal means against the driver, because it's completely allowed, right? So if Uber treats the drivers like contractors, it's completely legitimate for them to show this behavior, which is market-like, right? So it just means that they are smart entrepreneurs. But companies need to be aware that what they do is reflected in their workers' behavior or their customers' behavior, or any individual's organization's behavior really affected by algorithmic management. Okay, so I also brought a few quotes, but you can read them up in the paper if you want. Let me just summarize the theory contributions here before I move into a more practice-oriented perspective. So what are the theory implications of our model? Let me just summarize. So IS literature largely sees OLPs, or online labor platforms, as marketplaces. However, we show that platforms also exhibit algorithmic control. They organize platform work without employment contracts, really relying largely on these algorithms to control workers. And so we conceptualize these two dimensions, right? On the one hand, algorithmic matching, on the other hand, algorithmic control. And so with this distinction, it is really possible to place online labor platforms on this two-dimensional plane. So in the context of Uber, the whole model would be fleshed out. But then there are other examples, right? Other online labor platforms or other platforms you can think of. One example is Airbnb, right? Airbnb is more like a marketplace. They exhibit less control, and Upwork is another example, right? So they are more typical marketplaces platforms. So the left side of the model would be more pronounced for these contexts. I don't know. Question to you: can you think of other examples? Can you think of other examples where probably platforms where algorithmic matching may be more relevant, or maybe algorithmic control? Happy to discuss that later. Anyway, another contribution is that we really flesh out algorithmic management and subdimensions, thinking about data, thinking about dynamic pricing, nudging, and power. Okay, but let me move to the management implications. So I think I kind of already pointed towards the fact that we really think that algorithmic management is a double-edged sword, right? You see the angel, you see the devil smiley there, right? There's two aspects to it, right? It really depends on implementation. So we really call companies, platforms to design algorithmic management ethically. And one way to do so is really to create a win-win situation for all stakeholders involved. And you could tell that if you don't do so, that may result in adverse behaviors that are not good for the company. Just think about the gaming, right? I mean, you know, if you design algorithmic management a certain way, then your stakeholders may gain you back. So we really think that Uber and others should really create win-win situations. I can think about a lot of context, right? Just think about, there's an Apple Watch right there. Think about AI-powered personal reward systems that can also benefit the worker or lead to worker safety, right? If you think about personalized real-time nudges that can adjust to environmental variables, right? Someone is walking to a danger zone and they get a message. It can also be used for worker safety, for instance. The second one really focuses on transparency related aspect, the next two ones. The first one is really given that algorithmic nudging, algorithmic management is really dependent on huge amounts of data being collected, identifying patterns in the data, feeding them into the algorithms, real-time adjustment, and so on. If without that, it wouldn't be possible, right? So we think it's very important for companies to share data about really the data collection and storage. So the GDPR is probably a good starting point to do that, but really more is needed. And then lastly, the third one is really explaining the algorithm's logic, making these algorithms more transparent. Really being able to answer questions about the why, right? A lot of drivers, Uber drivers, they don't know why they're exposed to certain nudges. Only if individuals, workers, customers, you can think about all contexts, like buying a product, voting for a special, incentivizing someone to vote for a specific party, to be safe, right, at work. So it's really important that more information is shared about the why, the underlying logic of the algorithms, because that really results in the fact that individuals are not, manipulated as much, but that they are more can take informed decisions, but that they are guided by algorithms in a positive way. And that is, of course, super important also for algorithmic fairness, right? If you think about transparency, it's really important. So these are all actually insights from the HBRs we've published there. Let me just summarize. really some best practices that we think are important in addition to those three that I kind of highlighted. Is sharing information, being more transparent, inviting feedback. In the Uber case, maybe inviting drivers to the table, building in human contact. I think is super important when it comes to algorithmic management. Even if you think about Amazon workers, they have their wristbands, right? That guide them to kind of move their hand to the left or to the right to respond to certain if they want to have to pack packages or get something out of the shelves. So building in human contact can really lead to the fact that workers feel less like robots but more like humans, because that's what a lot of drivers said, right? They said we feel like robots because we're managed by a robot. So that made them very unhappy. So some human contact could probably be good. And then lately building trust, right? So if you're just fair to your workers, they don't try to fight back. And in the long term, that's probably also better for your reputation. Well, that's all I got. I know it's really warm in Portugal right now. I know this is the last presentation before you all can go home. Yeah, but still super happy to be here. I hope you found that interesting. And if there's some questions, I would be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mareike. It was a brilliant presentation. Thank you. Something that comes, just one question that comes from my heart right now, very simple one. We are going to the better future or a worse one? Because I'm very worried about that. What do you think? Where are we going as a society?
That's such a good question, because the ethics is really important, right? So I think it really depends. I think it can go either way, or some will go this way, others will go this way. So I can only mention that there's a lot of backlash against nudging and algorithmic management because there are all these bad examples that are bad for the workers. We think about Uber. But I can also mention that, for instance, I have recently been invited to a roundtable at the United Nations where we were reflecting on how algorithmic nudging can be used to make individuals behave more sustainably, right? How algorithmic nudging can help to foster climate-friendly behaviors. So it really depends on the organization that is implementing these mechanisms. It's like a knife, right? You can use a knife as a tool and to, put butter on your bread, or to stab someone. And I think generally technologies are like that. They are double-edged sword. We really need to be careful how we use them, but they can also be used in a good way.
Okay, thank you. Is there any question from the floor? Yeah, please. Could you listen? Could you listen? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you a bit. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I want to ask about the lifetime effects of algorithmic nudge. To nudge someone, you said that's not unethical. It's all right. I have no problem with it. To nudge someone to do something with encouraging and reward systems, it is not unethical by itself. But I want to make an example from Amazon, and the workers there, they don't go to the toilet because of the metrics that they see from other employees, and they want to catch up with them. So the algorithm nudge them to catch up with others. And if they catch up, they reward it or something like that. So I think, or another example with Uber drivers. If they don't work, they don't get paid. So what role plays insurance for them? Maybe I'm not able to work for 3 weeks because I'm sick. And what happens with them? So can I pay my rent? I think, what's your opinion? How can we assure that these kinds of problems I name them capitalistic problems in long-term term. How can we avoid something like that in future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I did not understand everything because I'm online, but I understood that. I think you asked about, you mentioned the potential downsides of nudging, and we're referring to Amazon workers. And all these horrible examples which are, they completely agree, it's a total no-go. We need to design those ethically. I think one really major problem is that regulators are just too slow to respond to digital innovation, right? So there are these new developments usually, and then it takes a long time until policymakers change in order and catch up with that. And Uber is a good example, right? Uber rightfully was criticized a lot. And then I was living in London at that time. And then at some point, it took a few years until they threatened to withdraw their license. And then suddenly, so many things changed. Suddenly, Uber made sure that workers' conditions are different, that they have sick leave, that they have a minimum wage. Suddenly, they all, they will all have electric cars by, I don't know, I think 2022, 25, something like that, right? So I think that is a really good example showing that sometimes these digital companies, or their innovations in digital technologies, then, but then they're kind of in a middle spot, in a blurred middle, and then regulators don't know what to do, and it takes them years to respond. But once they respond, the situation is better. I completely agree with the fact that there's a lot of bad examples out there. I'm just saying, and I'm thinking about the work by Zuboff about surveillance capitalism, right? She explicitly says, well, this work by Taylor and Sunstein, they got the Nobel Prize in economics for nudging in 2008. I do not agree with the fact that this is something good. It's super negative. My personal opinion is I'm in the middle. It depends on implementation. It can be very dangerous. It can be used for good. And as I mentioned earlier, we've been invited to meetings and also provided some feedback for a report at the UN, where they're thinking now about how to use algorithmic nudging for good, right? Making individuals behave more sustainable. But I completely agree, it's very risky, it's dangerous, and policymakers have to step in to really make sure that their workers' rights are being, that workers' rights are being in place. And then companies have to act ethically too, beyond regulation. And if not, because, they want to do good, or maybe also because they're self-interested, they just want to make sure that they have a good reputation, because there will be backlashes, right? If you treat your drivers, if you treat your workers, Amazon workers back, there will be definitely backlashes. So ethics are very important. I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question from the floor? Now is it changed? Federico? Okay.
Well, I also know that you're about to leave for the weekend, so.
No, we're very tired because it's a very long day. And
I know.
It's warm, very, very warm. You cannot imagine. And in fact, from your presentation, I think that we are worried. I'm worried about this model that this algorithms matching, algorithms control, and for us, from the quality management perspective, control, where you're using supervision, repeatability, it's just the first step of quality management. Then there is assurance, there is improvement, and so on. So we're just thinking that after control is going to be more and more and more. And wow, it's, at least for me, it's very personal. It's very scary. But well, we'll see. I just take your sentence. I like it very much. Algorithm is your boss. That's, wow, again, scary. Thank you very much for being here after your post-COVID. That I hope that you feel better. It has been really a pleasure, and we really appreciate that you can have some time for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great weekend, everyone. Thanks for inviting me.